We've now reached the point where most GraphQL tutorials end after making a very simple JavaScript-based application. We're going to continue on and implement a few more tools to get everything to be type safe, and we're going to start with GraphQL Nexus. So far what we've been doing is something called schema first. If we head over to our server, we can see we're declaring the schema up front. This does work great for small applications, but it doesn't scale very well. There's no really good way to get TypeScript definitions out of this schema. What we're going to do is change from using a schema first approach to using a code first approach. That's where we write code first, namely TypeScript, and we're going to generate this schema automatically based on our type definitions. We're going to be doing that using a tool called GraphQL Nexus. We can see down here there's a very simple example of how it works. We're going to use TypeScript to define our types, and it's going to generate the GraphQL schema for us. If we click on Docs, we're going to come over here and see a very simple example. You can see they import all these utility types, and then we go ahead and define our types. For example, they have an account type, which is an object type. It has a name, it has definitions for the fields, and so on and so forth. You can also have a query type and an enum type as well. We could use this, but there's actually a newer syntax I've been trying out, and that one is called Nexus Decorators, which is based on TypeScript, classes, and decorators. It is very early in development, but I'm finding it pretty good, so we are going to go ahead and use this and see how it works. But the same ideas do apply, so if you prefer to use something a bit more battle tested, you can use this kind of object syntax as well. Just to save a little bit of time, I created a few scripts, and I'm going to show you those now. Inside a package.json, I have my build schema step, and it's going to call this function or this file called GraphQL schema.ts. If we head over to the GraphQL schema file, we can see we have this kind of little bit of boilerplate code here. We're importing make schema from Nexus, and that's going to generate our schema for us. And we defined a few different options. We have the outputs, which is going to be where the types are generated, as well as the schema is generated. And we're also going to have our context type, which represents that context object we've been using for an in-memory database this entire time. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and see what happens when we execute this script. If we execute the script, we're just going to call the GraphQL schema file, and all that's going to do is go ahead and execute this. So let's go ahead and see what happens. We're actually calling build schema, and that's going to import schema, but it's the same thing. It's just going to execute this. If I head back to my terminal now and run yarn build schema, we are going to get an error, and that's because we haven't defined the context file yet. It's trying to load it, but we haven't defined it. So let's go ahead and define that one right now. I'm going to create a new file called context.ts, and as long as this one exists, we're going to get rid of that error. So let's just go ahead and import a new class called context. That should be enough to generate our very first code first schema. If we save this one off and head back to our terminal and run yarn build schema again, we have no errors, and we've generated two files. We created this Nexus gen.ts file, which has a bunch of very difficult to read type definitions, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And we also have the schema.graphql file. So far, it just has a very simple top level query, and the idea is going to be getting this to match up to our entirely own schema, which is the one we defined over here. So these eventually need to be matching up. So let's go ahead and define some more of our entities. We're going to start with app and books. The first thing we're going to do is create a new file for app, and we're also going to create one more new file, and this one is going to be for book. And we're now going to define everything using TypeScript moving forward. The first thing we're going to do is import a few things from Nexus Decorators. In this case, we're going to import this Nexus function, which has all of the type definitions we're going to need. The next thing we're going to do is export a class of book, and this is going to contain a bunch of decorators. In this case, we're going to use the object type decorator. Again, we are using the decorator syntax, but if we head back to the documentation, it's just going to be this exact same function. We're going to pass in a number of arguments here. One of the nice things about GraphQL is it is self-documenting, so we're going to go ahead and document this one and just say represents a book. Finally, we're going to define a few fields inside of here. So we're going to start off with one called title, which is what we need to have. We're going to again give this some decorators, so we're going to say nexus.field.nonnull.string. It's going to be a non-nullable string type, and it is going to be the title. And just to get something working, I'm going to return title for now. We can actually document this one as well, and I'm going to go ahead and do that with a description and just say title of the book. We need one more of these, which is going to be the ID. So let's just go ahead and define that one as well. And it's going to be exactly the same. It's just going to be called ID instead. And for now, I'm just going to return 1 just to get this one working. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and work on our app type. I'm going to head over to the app file now, and we're going to declare this one as well. It is going to be fairly similar, so I'm just going to copy over book, and we're just going to rename this one to be called app instead. It's not going to have an ID and a title, rather it's going to have a book type, and this is going to be a nexus.field.nonnull, or it's going to be a non-null list rather, and that's going to also contain a values that are not going to be null, and these ones are going to be types, so it's going to be a more complex type. In this case, it is going to be a book type, so we're going to go ahead and import that. Finally, it looks like we have made a mistake here. Let's go ahead and delete those, and now our syntax highlighting is all correct, and we've got rid of all of our errors. So just to confirm this again, we're going to have a GraphQL field, which is not going to be null. It is going to be in a list or an array, which is going to contain non-null types, which are going to be book types. And this is going to give us nice type completion. This should be books instead of book. And this is going to return an array for now. Let's just go ahead and create a new book just to get something working. And in this case, we're just going to have an empty constructor. Finally, we need to tell GraphQL or GraphQL Nexus which types we're going to use. And what that means we need to do is head back to our schema file and import the correct types. And that's actually going to be inside of here. What we're going to do is import our app type here, and we're also going to import our book type, and that's going to give us the correct type generation. Finally, let's go ahead and give this one a try and see what happens. If I run this, we should be generating our new schema, and it should be a little bit more interesting. And this is getting much closer to what we were expecting. We have our type app, which contains a book of non-nullable, a list of non-nullable books, which is exactly the same as over here. And we have exactly the same with our book over here. We have our ID and our string, both of which are non-nullable. What we haven't got yet is our mutation and query types, and that's something we're going to focus on in the next lecture.